I was still a little naive at that point because I thought like, oh, now I'm my cloud practitioner, like the doors are going to open up for me. But come to find out that's not the case.
Like, I'll be very honest, internships had been the most tough.
And if you're trying to get your first job, that's sometimes the hardest one to get, right? It's kind of a show don't tell type thing because there is no one path.
Interviewing is really tough.
I do not want to do programming.
I've seen 4-page resumes. I've never read a 4-page resume. I never will.
And what I used to do, you're gonna laugh. What I used to do is I used to go up and down the elevator, networking with people.
Confidence is not something like that, okay, you have gained confidence and now it's there. I think it's like a roller coaster. It keeps going up and down.
We don't really know what this role looks like, but it seems like you might be good at it. So would you like to come and, have an interview? And I said, shit, okay, cool. Yeah, why not?
You never know, so just start applying. So that's why I just went crazy with it. And I was doing that for like 3 to 4 months before.
Sorry, I'm going so fast and I know I talk fast. I'll pause for a second.
Oh boy, do I have a video for you. 6 different people from 6 different backgrounds like support, self-teaching, bootcamp, and the thing that these people all have in common is that they all landed a job in the cloud industry, but in slightly different ways. So in this video, we're going to hear from all 6 of those people and hear about how exactly they landed those jobs in the cloud industry. One of the first people we'll be talking about today is Mitchell from LA. Now, his journey into the cloud industry essentially was entirely from scratch, but his whole story actually only lasts 6 months. So the next person we'll be talking to today is Bryant. He landed a job in the cloud industry after just 10 months. He'd previously been working in sales for over 8 years, but managed to make the transition into the cloud industry and found a job actually through community, which is something we'll talk a bit about later, and I alluded to that at the start as well. Next up, we have Nancy. Nancy's from India, and her story is very much about open source, about projects, about writing, about putting work online and using that to build a network and ultimately land a job. So we'll be talking to her as well. So the next person we'll be talking to is Linda, who's from New York. She went to the Flatiron Bootcamp and she was able, through some clever networking, to be able to land a job back in her previous employer working as a software engineer. She then progressed up to become an SRE and now she works for Amazon Web Services. And next up, we'll be talking to Stephen, who is from Australia, and he got into the cloud industry through the support and help desk route, which might be a route that many of you are looking to take. Now, you might also recognize him from his training videos as part of A Cloud Guru. And then finally, we have Matt. Matt's been in the tech industry for well over 20 years, and he's interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of software engineers at this point. So he's going to give us a really nice perspective about the job hunt from the other side of the table, from the hiring manager's perspective. Now, we've got 2 people in this video that actually landed jobs within the last few months. So very recently, very recent stories with some real success and some real failures and some real learnings. You might not need a degree. In fact, you might not need much of anything other than an ability to learn, pick up new skills, showcase those skills to employers, and then have just the serious amount of determination that it takes to get through the job hunt process to ultimately land that first job, which in many cases can be the hardest. Now, this is something that came up in my conversation with Linda, and I want to hand you over so that you can have a listen to what she has to say.
They say in some industries just get your foot in the door, but maybe in some industries you could get boxed. I do feel that in tech, you don't really get boxed if you put in the work to then get those other skills. It's actually accessible to get those other skills. You don't need to go back to school to get a degree. You literally have this information online. And maybe other industries, like going into becoming a doctor or becoming a lawyer, there's much more of a plan and it's set. And even then I would say networking is just important, is very important. But I think in tech, there are no rules and prerequisites in the sense of that you have to go to school.
Exactly, and that's the good news, that the tech industry itself is very flexible. So when it comes to looking for that first job, be open-minded if you can to different jobs, different roles, and then potentially look for opportunities where you might be able to do things like making an internal transfer or be using that job as leverage to get the next job moving on from there. I see a lot of people that come into the industry and they get very fixated on one specific role. Now, architecture is one that comes up a lot where people see that and they, that's the role that they want to land immediately as their first role. Now, it's up to you. It's always a very personal decision, but what I would say is do understand that it can be very flexible to move about between roles. Not a lot of people understand this. They think that sometimes you might get boxed in if you make a decision to go down one path, but this is very rarely the case. 9 times out of 10, having some sort of start point is better than nothing, and from there you can leapfrog, make an internal move or something like that into a different position. And that's the thing. So this ambiguity around cloud roles is both a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And it's why it's really important that you need to get clear on which types of jobs you're applying for so that you can then work back from that. Let's have a listen to what Stephen, Linda, Mitchell, and Bryant had to say on this topic.
It's interesting because cloud computing itself is not always a beginner thing. And what I mean by that is there's so many adjacent skills in tech that are just, you could come from. Like if you have networking background or programming background, but you might have never touched cloud services. And that starting point is very different than somebody who's a complete beginner.
And, I was still a little naive at that point because I thought like, oh, now I'm my cloud practitioner, like the doors are going to open up for me. But come to find out that's not the case. Especially, with cloud, it's not necessarily considered a entry-level tech job. So, there were definitely some concerns. Overall, it took me about 10 months from start to finish from getting my CCP to landing my first job. Yeah, I was applying then to a lot of jobs thinking that at least someone would bite, and just got nothing after the cloud practitioner. So that's when I went on to the solutions architect. After that, still nothing really. Then I got my developer associate. And then still after that, wasn't really getting any traction with the job application. So that's when I started to look into the Cloud Resume Challenge. So you have to be honest with yourself and understand that it's going to take time. You're going to have to spend a little bit of money on courses and exams.
Like a lot of brilliant young men, I had the big picture in my head of like, I'm too good to do support. I'm perfectly ready to go off and be a sysadmin. I'm perfectly ready to go off and do all these things, right? Because of course, that's nothing anyone ever thinks, right? That's totally unique. So I had that whole thing in my head as well. And it's like, right, this is a lot harder than I thought to get into the industry.
Because the thing is, I was very selective before that on what jobs I was applying to because I knew I was a beginner. So I was only looking like, if they maybe want 1 year of experience, I'll apply. There's almost none that say they want someone with 0 to 2 nowadays. So I was extremely selective. And in one of the other Discords, I was asking people like, I don't know what to do. There's just like not many jobs out there. What I feel like for someone who's a beginner like I am, and they literally said like, just start applying. If it sounds interesting to you, and if they use some of like the tools that just apply to it. Especially if it says like entry level. I mean, if it's anything from like 3 or less years, just apply to it. Like just who cares? Worst that happens, they say no, or you just don't get a response. It's whatever. You never know. So that's why it was around April when I started just to shift my gear. Like, all right, anything entry level, I'm just going to apply to it. I mean, anything entry level that still piques my interest. Like I focused in AWS, so I wasn't, necessarily looking for Azure or Google Cloud jobs. At least for me, I learned like Python, Terraform, Ansible, etc. So I still looked at the job descriptions like, all right, do I actually have like some of the skills they want? So I wasn't just like applying to every entry level role, but a good chunk of them, because they just kind of said, you never know. So just start applying. So that's why I just went crazy with it. And I was doing that for like 3 to 4 months before finally, getting a role. I wish I actually kept track because it had to have been insane, like an insane number of applications. I was doing it, 3 times a day. It was just like a full-time job, it felt like. But this is when I started every single morning when I wake up, apply to jobs. And I was going to LinkedIn, ZipRecruiter, like, etc., all of them every single morning. In the afternoon, I would be applying to jobs just to see if there's any new ones. And then at night before I went to bed, I would be applying to jobs. And I mean, even just applying to easily, I feel like on a slow day, at least 30 jobs a day.
And that's the thing, there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet that's really hypey and it's talking about how you can get into the cloud industry and all of the benefits and the perks. But oftentimes people don't talk very much about the grind, the hustle, and the work that has to go into it. So I think it's important that you see that so that you're mentally prepared for it as you go into this journey in the job search, because it is going to be difficult at times and perseverance and determination is going to be critical. So when I was talking to Linda about this topic, she told me an incredible story of her early days of getting into the cloud. Now, when she told me the story, I was super excited because she mentioned some factors in here that are things that I'm always mentioning for people to do, and that's exactly what she did. So when I run this clip, pay attention and have a think to yourself, what are the different factors of success in this story? And then I'll, when we get to the end of the clip, I'll tell you why I was so excited about this story in particular from Linda.
And part of the process for me for that year was figuring out what my first role will be. I actually started out with mobile development because I actually wanted to build mobile applications. And that's what I thought I would maybe enjoy. But I decided to do some research locally. And I realized, what are the transferable skills I have right now? I work in TV production in corporate. I have access to a digital team because they are in this company. So I go to HR and I'm like, hey, I would love to shadow the digital team. And so I end up getting connected to the head of digital for Fox. This is before I left. And I was like, hey, I kind of want to get into tech and I would love to know, what do you need? What talent do you need? What are the gaps and skill sets you have? And I asked about mobile development and they said they hire third party. They're not hiring internally currently for mobile. And I realized that at that time, which was like 2015, they weren't, a lot of the companies were kind of having these other smaller consulting companies like build these mobile ends of their product, and the in-house was web development and they needed JavaScript developers. And I was like, oh, so I decided that I'm not going to go based on what I thought the role I would go for. I decided I'll shift what I'm learning to be web development. And so I went to a coding bootcamp for web development.
I don't know, maybe we should just end the video here because this story includes some critical components that I think are vital when it comes to landing a job in industry. The first one of those is that Linda worked backwards from the job market. So she looked at the opportunities that she had around her, she created opportunities, but importantly, she actually went out there, gathered research, spoke to people, and figured out what were the skills the market was actually demanding from her, and then she adapted her plan. This is something that I see so many people trip up on because they go online and they build a learning plan that's very much around skills that they think the market needs, but it might not be what the market is actually currently demanding where you're located or at this exact point in time. So this is vitally important. Go and look at job descriptions, go and speak to people in the industry so that you can understand what the market is demanding and then be open to adapting and be flexible to changing your plan, just like Linda was as well. So the second core component of Linda's story that I really liked was that she put herself out there and she made the ask. This is what a lot of people don't do. They're in these communities, they have these opportunities to speak to people, to ask questions, to push for the things that they need or want, but they don't do it. There's a lot of opportunities out there that are hidden in plain sight if you're just willing to make the ask, come out of your comfort zone a little bit. And it was incredible to hear from Linda that's exactly what she did, because I think that's something that was also present throughout the other stories, is at some point you're going to have to go out there, you're going to have to be a bit pushy, and you're going to have to make the ask. Okay, so this idea of working backwards from the market wasn't something actually that was specific to Linda's story. It was something that also came up in my conversation with Nancy, so I want to let you have a listen to what she had to say.
So what I did, like I went through a lot of startups and their job and the career pages and the job description. And then I came across one organization which had similar to what I was doing at my open source project. It involved a lot of Python scripting, taking care of CI/CD pipelines, exploring a lot of cloud stuff. So when it came to the job search, like the internship search, I think I knew that, okay, these are the few things which I worked on my project, these technologies. And Jenkins, which can be an abstraction of CI/CD, Kubernetes and Docker, the abstraction of containers. So I think what I did when I was looking for a job, I looked for these abstraction and instead of technologies. And I think it also depends on the organization. Some organizations really write good job description. And one of the place where I applied and I got into my first internship, it was, I think they had a pretty much decent job description where they mentioned that we have to set up CI/CD, or we have in Jenkins. You should have some experience with this. It's okay if you don't have, we can learn. But when I applied for startups in India, then there was a focus on technology. They were, because I guess like startup has a very fast moving cycle and it would be nice to have someone who has an expertise. So for few startups when I applied, they did ask me that do you have specific knowledge of this? Do you have an experience of setting up Terraform? Do you have experience of setting up Tecton? So that was something which added up there.
And once I finally started getting some like interviews and what people were asking me, that's definitely when I switched gears a little bit, because I was kind of focusing on just a little bit of everything. And then that's when I realized, after going through a lot of interviews, and once they started getting the technical interviews, take-home assessments, it seemed like all they cared about, all the questions they ever asked, all the technical like take-home like assessments and things like that were just all based around like, all right, how's your programming skills? How's like your Kubernetes skills?
I think that cloud roles aren't well explained sometimes, and they evolve so quickly that I think every company does them differently, which is why I think it's also important to know which companies you're aiming for, because you could then look at their job postings and know how they quantify it, because it is important. It doesn't have to be the end goal, but it gives you a direction. So it's a dance. You learn enough to get to the point that you could start exploring where to go. So don't worry yourself when you're starting out to fully know where you're going. Get to the point that you could understand what's flying. Then try to it's kind of like this balancing act, and talk to people, network, look at videos about people's cloud journeys. You're going to learn a lot more. Like SRE, for example, which is a role I went to, some people have to code in that role, some people don't.
I think you probably called this out in some of your earlier ones too, but pretty much everything's negotiable. So like, you must have 3 years of experience with whatever. That is a guideline, and it's intended to whittle things down. I really recommend that people focus on having a T-shaped skill set. If I think that's probably something that most people are familiar with. It basically means that you've got a broad base. If you're forced to, you can write some CSS or something like that. But really what you're very, very good at is building APIs, or what you're very, very good at is setting up CI/CD pipelines or something like that. You'll only really need to be very good at one thing.
So what Nancy said there at the start, I think, is really important about the abstractions. Because a lot of job descriptions, and like Matt said, employers can be flexible when it comes to years of experience in specific tools, but you have to know what is that technology and abstraction of, because potentially you can substitute in a different skill. This is something we talked about at the start when we talked about learning plans and then picking skills that fit those individual abstractions or categories. But that's something that you should look out for, because when you go out and reach out to employers or you put in these applications, you can talk about how you understand the underlying principles of like continuous integration or something like this, where they might be asking for Jenkins, but you've learned TeamCity or GitHub Actions. It doesn't often matter in most cases, so you can still apply for those jobs. The employer will be flexible, but just be prepared to be able to speak about the abstraction or the underlying concept, rather than thinking that if you don't know the precise skill that you're just going to be written off from the get-go. That's not necessarily the case. And exactly as Linda said, it's a dance. You actually need to get hands-on so that you can start to understand some of these technologies, and then at some point as well you need to develop a feedback loop. And the interviews and the job market and speaking to people is a great way to build that feedback loop that will allow you to adjust your job hunt plan. So if you are someone that's been building for quite a while, you've been learning skills, watching courses, maybe it's time to hit the market and see where you land and try and get some feedback from recruiters or hiring managers as part of the application process. Or on the other side, if you've been analyzing a lot, you've been looking at your skills, you've been building a plan, maybe it's time to actually get hands-on, start to play around with some of the technologies, and then eventually iterate through that and adapt. And as Nancy mentioned, the size of the company matters, because if you apply for a startup, like she says, maybe they want some specific tech skills and you want to hit the ground running. But the other side of the coin is that oftentimes small companies and startups can be a lot more flexible when it comes to the hiring process. They might be less rigorous, or they might not have as many hoops to jump through in order to land that first job. It really comes down to you, but what I would say is mix your strategy up. If you're applying only for big companies, also think about smaller companies or mid-sized companies, or just ultimately have a variance, because the hiring process definitely differs between these different companies, and it might play to your strengths if you twist your strategy a little bit and apply for a company of a different size. Now, while we're in the topic of talking about the job hunt and landing that first job, I actually want to hand over to Stephen, because Stephen comes from a support background and has the experience coming up through that route. Now, I know a lot of people might be considering that, and if you're not, you might be considering it in the future, because maybe you go out there and find that for you it's actually quite difficult and you're looking to get your foot in the door with a job that might have some easier entry requirements, and for a lot of people, support is that opportunity for them. However, it's not without some things that you need to look out for, so let's have a listen to what Stephen has to say.
Support really is very valuable, and it's a great way to start. It's just one of those things that you can't get stuck in for too long, because of course, if you've been doing support for 10 years, it's a lot harder to move up than if you've just been doing support for like 2 years. One of the challenges that comes in there is that people fall into the realm of like, you're too valuable where you are. We can't move you into another role because then the rest of the stuff just wouldn't work. So we kind of have to keep you there. At some point we'll look after you, but not right now. And that's where people tend to get really stuck, because if they're really good at their job and then it's like, we can't afford to move you up, it's just not possible. Or alternatively, in a lot of organizations still, we're not interested in moving you up. Like, why would we want to pay you more? We can just, keep squeezing you as you are. And I kind of did what I've done throughout my career, and that's going a little bit outside my box, finding ways to be useful, finding ways to learn things and be interesting, and eventually them saying, oh, cool, you're already doing this job, we'll just pay you to do it anyway. It's like, works for me. That's right. It's the relationship building as well, because especially for internal movements, having good relationships with the teams that you want to move into, understanding, what they do, having good relationships with them where they're like, I like this person, I want to work with this person, let's bring them up into this role, right? But always being aware of like how far away that ceiling is and how you're going to either break through it or get around it.
Exactly. So the support role can be a great way to get your foot in the door. However, one word of warning when it comes to the support role is that sometimes it can be a little bit of a two-step process. So landing that role can take a certain amount of effort, but then also if you're looking for another role beyond support, as Stephen says, you might need to build relationships and work with people internally so that you can set up a transition to another role. And then at the end of the day, that might not materialize within that company, just as Stephen said. You have to realize how close you are to that, and if there is a ceiling above you and you're not going to be able to make the transition, and then you potentially might need to make the leap to a different company in order to continue progressing. But that's just a word of caution there, because the story doesn't end as soon as you land that support role, because then if you have aspirations to move on, then there's another step in that process as well. And it might not necessarily be easy, but it could be easier now that you have some professional experience. And if you have the opportunity to move internally, that can really be an opportunity that you might want to exploit or take advantage of if you're struggling to land that first job. So as Stephen and Linda said, when it comes to making those internal moves, look at building relationships with those inside of your company. Go and speak to them. Try and find ways to make yourself useful. Go a little bit outside of your own responsibilities, but obviously in a responsible way. And then you might find that the employer starts recognizing that you're ambitious and that you're pushing for those and you're building the skill sets needed in order to transition into the slightly different or adjacent role. In the last video, we talked quite in depth about resumes. However, they're also very vital when it comes to the job hunt. So I want to talk just a little bit about that as well.
The big challenge of that first step is trying to get through to that interview. Like, however you get that stuff done, that, first bit with the resume, the cover letter, it's about getting to that interview. Once you're at that interview, it's a different ball game. There's, your, like, they don't want to know what's in your resume at that point. They want to ask you questions about your experience, your knowledge, your passion, your learning, your story, all those kinds of things, right? As you well know, when we start looking at resumes, the first thing, as hiring managers we look at is the very top of it. And that kind of like immediate bias. And by the time you get down a little bit further, that perception's already colored. So there's a lot of emphasis put on like the top of that resume to tell the story and to have that story immediately visible.
Resumes really need to summarize. I've seen 4-page resumes. I've never read a 4-page resume. I never will.
So I don't have one resume. I simply don't. It's just, it would make no sense for me to have a single resume. If I was like, if I look at all my different AWS certifications and I was to say, I think there's 7 of them on there, I would probably just go with one. And it's like AWS Certified Solution Architect Pro, right? That says enough. The fact I've got all the associates, all the other things, right? That's, it's just kind of noise. Like, that one thing says more than all the others. And in fact, it says more because it's sitting there standalone rather than with everything else, right?
When I get your resume, if you've listed your GitHub, I'm definitely going to go and look at it. Sometimes I see lots of interesting things. And, like I'm already excited by the time I'm going to meet you because I went and looked at some of the work that you've done. Sometimes it's like I'll see Create React app has been forked or something like that, and that's it. And I'm like, okay, I mean, it doesn't tell me you're bad. It tells me nothing. And you maybe shouldn't have put that on your resume because it's a waste of my time to go and look at it. I don't want to give the impression that I have a lot of time to do this. This is probably 5 minutes prep before the interview starts. But I do look at those things if they're available to me. But I mean, by the same, if you don't have that because you've done all your greatest work, in a private repo for your companies that you've worked for, that's fine. That's not a deal breaker as far as I'm concerned. It's not everyone has to contribute to open source. Not everyone has to be, a member of some public community or something like that. Definitely had some great experiences with people who had nothing public to show, but then could show a lot once they joined the team.
And that's the thing, when it comes to tech, you really need to consider those things like GitHub, portfolio, and all of those different types of evidence as an extension of your resume. They're not two different things, they're kind of part of the same thing. And they all lead to creating some of that intrigue with the hiring manager that hopefully is going to draw them in and actually invite you into an interview where you can hopefully impress them with some of your story and some of your skills and some of the things that you've been learning that you can't express very well just on a piece of paper. But of course, the question that I often get asked is, well, what project should you build? What are employees looking for? What should you factor into a project that you're building in order to help the job hunt? Now, before I spoke to Mitchell, I actually went through and found a project that he worked on that particularly stood out to me. And I would like to let him have a moment just to talk about that.
I still didn't exactly kind of know what other projects to do. I was just looking around at random projects and I came across that one on YouTube. So I kind of followed along and went through it. But then I kind of decided all right, let me just take this one now. And, as I learn more things, just try to do it differently. Because I think that one, I deployed to ECS Fargate. I think I did ECS and EC2. I think I did Lambda and, et cetera, all these other different variations. Because there really was a period of time where I thought all right, I already have one app or, one little project I did that utilizes ECS and Fargate, for example. So now I have to come up with something completely different just to show my skill with maybe some other serverless things or Kubernetes. And then I kind of, had a change of heart. What? I don't think that's the case. I'll just do the same project, at least just deploy the same application, just deploy it in different ways.
A good way to think about projects as well is about plugging gaps in your resume, finding areas that you're potentially weak in and then building projects to cover that gap when it comes to speaking to a hiring manager. Now, what you can do is do something like Mitchell said, which is take the same project. You don't have to rethink and come up with a whole new idea. You can take technology from an existing project you have, refactor it and update it to using a different technology. This is actually a great idea because it allows you to compare and contrast between the two different types of technology, which is then a great example to speak about in an interview and is another great thing to have on your portfolio. You don't need to come up with new projects from scratch. So when it comes to thinking about things like evidencing for your resume, there was a topic that came up in every conversation that I had with all of these 6 different people, and that was the topic of writing and how writing impacted them when it came to their own job hunt.
Something that you should do, I think, especially with certifications, people think that's going to open doors for them. It'll show that you can learn new things and pass a test, basically. But what I would do in these courses, if I could go back, would be to blog the courses, projects that you do in these courses. Rather than just going through and taking your notes, take some screenshots of what you're building in AWS. Design some diagrams of what you've built. I mean, I used Stephen Mareeks courses for my solutions architect and developer associate certifications, and actually built some pretty cool stuff with Lambda, DynamoDB, what else? VPC was a really cool lesson within the solutions architect course. So if you're taking these courses anyway and trying to get a certification, you might as well start to build a little bit of a portfolio.
So yeah, that is one of the good example. If you want to brush up concept, just build the project, a very small project, and just write about it. So that is something, this whole process, building and then writing about it and then just putting up, it really somehow it builds up confidence in me, and it has worked even in the past when I was applying for internship or reaching out to hiring manager, because I know that I have built the stuff, it's there in public.
Okay, let me just interrupt just for 1 second. If you're new around here to Open Up the Cloud, and what I'm doing is basically I'm just trying to make as much information as possible available to people so that they can break into the cloud industry. So if you can like the video, if you want to subscribe, I'm creating lots of videos all the time. If you want to share this on social media or with some friends, that would be amazing. If you want to leave a comment down below with some questions that you have that I can incorporate into a future video, that would be awesome, because then these videos can make their way to more people across the internet and hopefully help more people out. So that was it. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
But once I went to a coding bootcamp and was more in like I graduated from the coding bootcamp, that's when I started documenting things on Instagram specifically. And my choice of Instagram was because I was looking for more women in tech. And that was where there was a small community, but it was like a little bubble. And I was able to find other women in tech. And actually, when I was going through my journey, that's what inspired me to feel like I could do it, because there was one account called Coda Girl, and there's something about her account made me feel like I could do it because I see somebody more like me in it. And so I think that helped me psychologically too. And so then I just started documenting my journey on using photos and microblogging. Like it was like long captions and a photo and stuff like that. And that's how I started social media, and Medium blogs. I also was blogging on Medium a little bit, like just learnings and stuff, like, and part of the bootcamp actually required you to blog. You don't get the in-person opportunities as much, but there's social media, which in my opinion is even more scalable, because you could put yourself out to community on places like LinkedIn, and the right people also find you. You're not even the only person doing that. And I think if you lead with helping others, even when you're throughout your journey trying to do something, sharing your journey, that was something I was doing also online, and that helped me too. So the equivalent of the elevator today is way more scalable, because you could do it in a way that you're comfortable with. If you don't like to talk to people, no problem. Write a blog, do things that help other people, document a journey, document like even things that like we were worried about. I mean, more likely than not, something you're experiencing as a learner is something somebody else experiences. Interact on threads. You don't have to like do things the way somebody else does. Actually, if you want to find the people that you want to find that are more like in your way of doing things, do it your way. But like find that equivalent for you. That's what, because some people get stressed. They're like, I don't like social media. There are so many different mediums. You don't like video, you could write. You don't like this. You want to be anonymous, go through like anonymous thing and help people. Believe me. Then you could say in the interview, I'm this Sahindal. Call it whatever.
And another really great thing about writing is the fact that it can lead to networking opportunities. And that certainly was the case for a few people that I spoke to. Here's what they had to say about some networking opportunities that they got through writing about their projects.
Also, Discord, Slack, any of these like tech channels you can get into, I think is important as well. Even if you're not super active, just kind of reading what other people post, in the Cloud Resume Challenge Discord, there's a career advice channel that that's probably where I spent the most time, and just seeing what other professionals are saying about what skills they look for when hiring people, what tools they are working with, what skills are the best to learn. So I actually ended up getting my job from one of the channels in the Cloud Resume Challenge Discord.
If you just kind of get yourself involved with communities, I do think that is a way you can eventually get mentorship. Because if people see you in there and they see that like you really care and this like means a lot to you over a period of time, it can't just be for like a week and then you're asking people, like they will almost come to you. Because I've realized a lot of people in this industry who have been doing this for a while, or maybe not a lot, but maybe it's just that's just what I see in all these communities, is the guys who have been doing this for a while, like they really want to help people out, especially if it's people who like this means a lot to them, and they can see that they really want to have a career in this, they're just trying to get in. So like if it seems like people are pretty good with that, where if they see that you're like really working hard and putting in the work, they will almost reach out to you and help out. And that's like one scenario where it kind of did happen for me. Even if you don't get responses, you almost kind of learn how to solve your own questions, which I think is probably like a super big skill to have too. Because I was afraid of asking too many questions. And I don't think it's a good thing to be afraid to ask too many questions.
I was also on the forums a little bit as well. So forums definitely lead to things. That's definitely something like, contributions in community. That's like I'm proof of that. And also through other things in like, the Melbourne tech community, because of course, like at that point, there's still a bit of a presence in Melbourne, but quite a significant presence was in Melbourne. One of the recruiters reached out to me and said, hey, we're recruiting someone, to basically take on, that kind of ownership of, the student journey, the forums, our mentoring and support through our support system, all that kind of stuff, like the technical side of the front end of the student journey. And it's like, we don't really know what this role looks like, but it seems like you might be good at it. So would you like to come and, have an interview? And I said, shit, okay, cool. Yeah, why not?
And that's the thing, by putting yourself out there, by speaking to people in the community, that could really make the difference, like it literally made in Bryant's case, because that was ultimately what landed him the job, was the community, but his outreach, was putting himself out there, was being vulnerable, was speaking to people, and then eventually landing that job.
I think that especially when you're trying to get your first job, applying just with an application is way harder. Like maybe if you have a ton of experience on your resume and you're just applying, that could work. But if you're you're trying to get your first job, I think today utilizing network and community is not just a nice to have, it's the thing that will actually get you a lot of the times the job.
But how did I reach to those remote startups? That's a good question. And again, it's about open source and communities and meeting people. Like I think the first time when I did was Gitpod, and now it's Local Stack. So at Gitpod, it was through Pauline. I met her through community, and again, open source. So I guess with open source and communities, you increase a area of networking, and when you put out a lot of content and your contributions, you are like building a public profile. And in the case of remote, I guess it's not tough, it's just about reaching. I mean, your content should be reachable to them.
Networking is also really important too, especially for people who are not from traditional tech backgrounds trying to break in. I think that's a huge component of trying to make that transition. It gets really discouraging, especially towards the end of my search. That's why I kind of switched up my strategy and relied more on networking and asking for referrals, because if I reach out to one of my connections that works at a company that I see an open position for, the worst thing they can do if I ask them for a referral is either ignore me or say no, which is the same thing that these recruiters are doing when I apply through a job traditionally. Towards the end of my job search, I started realizing that, sending these resumes out, tweaking my resume, sending customized cover letters with each application and just getting no response back, like not even, hey, X, Y, and Z looks good about your profile, but, you lack X, Y, and Z. Like I'm not getting any kind of constructive feedback. So it would just a better use of my time to lean into my connections a little bit more, see if I can get some referrals for the jobs I was applying to. So rather than just, again, cold applying to the position that's on their website, I went to LinkedIn, looked up the company, clicked on the people tab, I hit up, I think I added the CEO, I DM'd the CTO, and I messaged one of the senior engineers there that had been working there for a few years just to see how she liked working there. But I messaged the CTO and said, hey, it looks like you're looking for a junior engineer. I just finished the Cloud Resume Challenge. I'm starting to work on some Terraform stuff right now. I'd love to chat with your team. He got back to me and said that he's going to have his project manager set up a meeting for me. And I think I messaged him on a Friday, a Thursday. Project manager messaged me on Friday with a couple of open time slots that she had. I scheduled an interview for Monday, and then the following week they offered me the position.
Then I just moved to another job based on an internal reference, which of course is a great way to move around because it usually means that your resume is going to go to the top of the pile and you're going to get into an interview pretty well. And once you get into the interview, that's where you can impress somebody. You can show something that isn't going to be there on the piece of paper, which is really important.
And this topic of networking leads on to another important topic, which is about internal referrals. If you can get someone that's within the company to vouch for you, what they'll do is essentially mark your resume, and that can bring it higher up in the pile. Those opportunities only typically come up though if you actually get out there, speak to people, involve yourself in a community and start to network. And then you can potentially get those internal references so that can help boost your resume. Because actually just cold putting in resume after resume into different companies where you don't have networking connections can be a difficult task. It certainly can work. It worked in Mitchell's case where this sort of brute force approach with submitting resumes. But one thing that you should apply into that as well is like what Bryant did, and reach out to people on social media, and actually then you can start to look for these internal referrals and create those connections that might ultimately lead to you landing a job. And that's one thing that people often overlook, is jobs often don't start off on a job board. They're shared first through people's network or on social media to see if anyone in their immediate network might want to apply for the job, because ultimately that's cheaper. However, if they can't find someone to fill the position, eventually the company might put that onto a job board and open it up to a broader pool of candidates. However, at that point, you might have a lot of different people that are applying to that job through the job board, so it can help. If you build your network, you might get some of these opportunities coming your way where you get a link to an application that might not have yet made it to a job board, and you might be one of the few candidates that's actually applying for that position, which then could put you in a better place. And that's the thing, a lot of these jobs that end up on job boards have first been published on social media or pushed out through individual people's networks. So if you can connect with these people, if you can join these communities, you might hear about these opportunities before they're pushed out to a job board and before they're getting lots of application from many different candidates. And you might stand a better chance earlier on in that process than later on when you're competing against a broader pool of individuals. So I hope these stories, these tips and this advice really helps you out, and it's something that you can incorporate also into your job hunt. This video is actually part of the AWS free cloud bootcamp, which is still ongoing. We will have at least one more career session. So if you want to, you can still submit your questions to openupthecloud.com/bootcamp survey, where I will be looking through some of those questions and trying to incorporate your questions into these videos that I'm making. But there's at least one more session, so let me know if you have any questions, stick them in that link. But I want to close out on a message from Bryant, something that he mentioned in our conversation that I thought would be fitting as a final message for this video. But as always, thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to sharing your I Got the Job post. Speak soon.
And you can't rush or cram learning new skills and concepts and tools. It's just humanly impossible the way our brains are set up. So you have to be honest with yourself and understand that it's going to take time. You're going to have to spend a little bit of money on courses and exams. It's going to be frustrating, but that's all part of the process of learning. When we learn to ride bikes, we start out with little training wheels and take them off and fall over a couple times, and we're going to get our knees scraped. So, but once you learn how to ride a bike, it's like you just kind of have that in muscle memory. So, I would just be honest with yourself and understand that it's going to take time. If you can document and blog early, share your projects with your network on communities like LinkedIn. Try to find a mentor if you can. Get into as many tech Slack or Discord channels as possible, because there's a lot of valuable information and resources in there too. So just lean into everything, but be focused.
So if you like this video, what I would suggest to you is at least go back and watch the last one. There's a couple of videos in this series from the AWS Cloud Bootcamp, and the last one is about resumes, where we dive deep into what hiring managers are looking for in your resume. So go check that one out. If you've already watched that, I've also done a video where I talked about a bunch of different job descriptions. I analyzed over 2,000 different job descriptions and extracted the different skills and tools, technologies that people are looking for in the cloud industry right now. Go ahead and check that out if you're looking about building your own learning plan, or if you're curious about what employers are actually looking for in the job market.